A retainer is basically a down payment for work to be conducted. So if you are hired to conduct surveillance on your client's spouse because she believes he is out partying every Friday with his former girlfriend, then you may want to obtain a retainer for that case. Why would you want to get a retainer? Quite simply to make sure that you get paid for your work and to ensure that the client does not get buyer's remorse and refuse to pay you because you never saw him out with his former girlfriend. In many cases like this, we may schedule 2 or 3 days or nights, as this example case would be, so our retainer should cover the majority of that work to be provided. But what if the case gets shut down early? There are actually varying things that can happen that can require you to shut down the case early. First, if you get burned, this is kind of a no-brainer, sort of. If the burn is just involving your car, then you may be able to use a different car. If you don't have a second vehicle, then renting one may be an option. If the burn is you, like he has seen you in the bar staring at him and his girlfriend, and he approaches you, then you are, well, then you're burned, folks. But does that preclude the investigation from continuing? This video is sponsored by OREP Insurance and Working PI Magazine. OREP is a leading provider of private investigator liability insurance. Visit orep.org for a quote today. In that event, I would bring in a subcontract PI to finish the case for me. The same would apply if the initial investigator was a subcontractor and got burned. I could then go out myself or bring in another sub to finish things off. However, you also need to consider the integrity of the entire investigation. What do I mean by the integrity of the investigation? Well, when he approached you or the other PI at the bar, did he say, "Hey, are you a PI and did my wife hire you?" That type of statement would obviously lead you to believe the integrity of the investigation has been compromised. However, if he said something like, "Hey dude, are you checking out my girlfriend or me?" well, then the investigation is probably safe, but he will notice you forever. If the integrity of the investigation has been compromised, then your client may want to cancel the entire investigation. What about the retainer? Does she get a refund? Does she get a partial refund? Does she get no refund at all? The answer to that is clearly defined to some extent in your contract. You should have a retainer section in your contract that clearly defines how much the retainer is, how it is used, and any terms of refund if the full retainer is not used. But it isn't as simple as that, folks. You need to also comply with your state laws regarding contracts and your private investigator licensing. Many states have rules about what can and cannot be charged for regarding legal and other services. So if you have a clause in your contract that states all retainer fees are non-refundable after work has commenced, it may not necessarily be held up in a court of law. If the state that you are working in has laws that are contradictory to that clause, then the laws will prevail. Many people don't understand this. Not everything in a contract is always enforceable in court. If you have a very lopsided or a one-sided contract, the entire contract could be thrown out in a court of law. You need to make sure that what you have in there is fair and is permissible. An example of an unfair clause would be something like this. All retainer fees are non-refundable regardless of how much work has been conducted. This obviously would not be accepted in a court of law. So when would non-refundable retainers be appropriate? Well, as I stated, make sure you know your state laws and what is permissible first. Secondly, I'm not an attorney, folks, nor do I play one on TV or here on YouTube for that matter, and nothing I say should be considered as legal advice. I would recommend before you employ a retainer policy, be it refundable or not, seek the advice of legal counsel. I would say for any one-off jobs like background checks, process serves, locates, things like that, they be non-refundable. Now these are a bit easier to make non-refundable as you can just have a simple fee for those types of services and not get a retainer. But with larger investigations, you will most likely be charging by the hour, as well charging for unknown expenses like mileage, travel time, meals, things like that. Thus, you need to have a retainer. Now, depending on your state laws, you may be able to get by with making all retainers non-refundable. But should you? Now, I do know some private investigators out there that make all retainers non-refundable. I don't, however, agree with that policy. I myself prefer to be fair with my clients and make sure that their best interest is my best interest. I do have clauses in my contract that clearly state when a refund is due, when one is not due, and how much of a refund it will be. Now, this gets a bit complicated, folks. Again, you need to know what you can and cannot do in your state. Now, the clauses in my contract are fairly simple and straightforward. First, I state that all unused portions of the retainer will be refunded. So if I am retained at $2,000 for a surveillance and all I use is $1,800 to complete the investigation, then the client will be refunded $200. This clause is reason enough for me to make sure that in all my quotes to my clients, I try to quote a retainer that will cover as close to 100% of the retainer as possible. I also have a clause in the contract that states all work will be terminated once the retainer funds have been used. So when the money runs out, I'm done working. But wait, I also have another clause that states if the retainer funds run out and we are in the middle of obtaining evidence, such as on surveillance, then at our discretion, we may continue the work and the client will be responsible for paying us for that additional work. This clause is for those rare circumstances, like if I'm working a slip and fall injury case and I'm on the final day, my retainer funds become exhausted, but I am getting video of my subject up on the roof, working the day away for the client's competitor, then I can, at my discretion, continue to obtain that video evidence. Now, the most important clause of my contracts related to retainers is still to come, folks. But here is another huge thing to keep in mind. What if the client wants to extend the contract? If you have a clause that states once all retainer is used, the investigation is concluded, or if you have a hard date of when the contract ends, then you may have to write a new contract for continued work. Now, in my contract, I have a clause that states something to the effect, if I accept further retainer funds from my client, then the contract is extended until those retainer funds are used. This means if I am on the final day of that slip and fall case and I call my client and I tell them what has transpired and they want me to continue working it 2 more days, all they have to do is send me more money and we are good to go. Now, one of the most important clauses regarding retainers in my contract relates to scheduled work, folks. Once you have scheduled the work, you have essentially taken yourself off the market for that day. You may be losing business if another client calls you and wants you to work that same day. I have a scheduled work clause that essentially states that if the client cancels the contract for any reason, all scheduled work is subject to a 50% refund. I have this clause for several reasons. One of the reasons is to make sure that the client is confident on what he or she wants us to do. As a rule, once we have the contract and the retainer in place, we generally schedule the work immediately. We, like any other business, have to have a schedule to make sure that all of the work gets done properly and on time for all of our clients. Now, enforcing this rule is entirely up to you folks should the situation ever arise. I myself have never forced this to happen with a client. I have only had a client request to cancel a contract early a few times. In all of those cases, it was a situation where the client had acquired new information that nullified the need for the investigation, such as a spouse filing for divorce or flat out admitting to having an affair. As well, in all of those cases, I knew I could reshuffle jobs around and make sure that the investigator that was scheduled to do that work still had plenty of work to do. So I refunded 100% of the unused retainer to my clients. In my personal opinion, I want every client of mine to feel that they have been treated fairly by me no matter the circumstance.